Here you are in the forests of Germany in winter, about 2,000 years ago. The temperature drops below freezing. The snow crunches underfoot, and the icy wind chills you to the bone. And standing before you is the greatest army of the ancient world, ready for a bloody battle that will last for hours. Sounds like an epic scene from a Hollywood historical film, doesn't it? But there's one small, utterly absurd detail that big-budget blockbusters almost always overlook. Most of these rugged, invincible Roman legionnaires are standing in the snow completely without pants. To a modern person, this sounds like a sophisticated form of voluntary frostbite. Go out into the cold today with bare legs, and you'll be back home with blue knees in 20 minutes. But Roman soldiers didn't just go out for a breath of fresh air. They marched, set up camps, and fought to the death. How is it even possible to survive in such harsh conditions, wearing nothing but a woolen tunic and leather sandals? This question has puzzled historians, physiologists, and reenactors around the world for decades. Today we'll unravel this mystery and understand why freezing without pants was a sign of true civilization. Ancient Rome built the greatest empire using methods that seem utterly insane to us today. Their approach to logistics, endurance, and even clothing shattered all conventional stereotypes of survival. Scientists have recently discovered that the legionnaires' methods of adapting to the cold were incredibly similar to modern sports medicine. It turns out that the human body is capable of withstanding sub-zero temperatures if internal heat is distributed properly, and Roman military commanders intuitively understood this mechanism long before the advent of thermal imaging and thermal underwear. It may seem unbelievable, but the facts speak for themselves. In this investigation, we'll dive into the dirtiest and coldest aspects of daily life in the ancient military. We'll examine every layer of their clothing in detail, from coarse woolen threads to the ingenious leather straps on their shoes. You'll learn why modern sports science is only now reaching the same conclusions as Roman centurions. So get ready for a long journey along the snow-covered roads of ancient history, full of unexpected discoveries. We'll walk this path alongside a legionnaire whose bare feet tread on the jagged German ice. We'll feel the weight of a soaked cloak and taste that very same surprising sour water with ancient vinegar. I promise that after this story, you'll never complain about the weather in your cozy city again. So, let's find out exactly how this ingenious heating system of the Eternal City worked. And we'll start with that very strange ban that nearly froze the greatest army of antiquity. The Romans were incredibly arrogant when it came to everyday men's fashion. For the typical citizen of the empire, the entire population of the vast world fell into two very simple categories. There were civilized people in proper tunics, and there were savage barbarians in incomprehensible long pants. Putting these strange fabric tubes on one's legs was considered a true insult to Roman dignity. Modern fashion critics would simply weep with joy at the sight of such ironclad stylistic integrity. The whole problem was that pants were associated exclusively with the state's historical enemies. The Persians, Gauls, and Germans constantly wore this garment in their everyday, harsh lives. And in the eyes of the proud Romans, these peoples were illiterate savages, lacking manners and refined taste. For a legionary, wearing the clothing of defeated enemies was tantamount to a public admission of his own moral weakness. Imagine if a modern American Marine suddenly decided to march in a fluffy skirt. Roman philosophy clearly stated that a truly free man must wear only loose-fitting clothing. A loose-fitting woolen tunic allowed the body to breathe, emphasizing the high social status of its wealthy owner. Pants, on the other hand, were considered humiliating shackles for the legs, restricting the natural movements of a noble man. It sounds funny, but for the residents of the Eternal City, this was an absolutely serious and fundamental ideological stance. They sincerely believed that pants physically made a man more cowardly and pliable in battle. This strange obsession with clothing was originally shaped by the warm and comfortable Mediterranean climate. In Italy, the weather was beautiful for most of the year, requiring no serious or heavy insulation for the legs. The ancient Italians simply didn't understand why they should complicate their lives with extra pieces of thick fabric. Their ancestors had conquered half the known world with bare feet, and this became an unquestionable sacred tradition. In Rome, deviating from ancestral traditions for the sake of some personal comfort was considered an unforgivable crime. Even when the empire began to expand into the cold north, soldiers stubbornly refused to change their habits. Social pressure within the military camp was so strong that no one dared to stand out from the crowd. If a recruit had put on pants, the veterans would have instantly made him a laughingstock in front of the entire legion, and becoming a laughingstock among a group of armed and stern men was worse than any serious physical pain. Therefore, young soldiers preferred to shiver from the cold, but maintain their proud Roman appearance. The most interesting thing is that Roman emperors later even issued laws officially banning the wearing of trousers in the capital. They saw this comfortable clothing as a direct threat to national identity and ancient cultural traditions. Violators faced huge fines and even disgraceful expulsion from the city for such a fashion faux pas. The state literally told its citizens that freezing for the sake of the fatherland was their sacred patriotic duty. Today, politicians argue about taxes, but back then, they seriously debated the legality of wearing warm trousers. This entire aesthetic system worked perfectly as long as the legions fought within the warm climes of Italy and Greece. The sun shone, the birds sang, and enemies scattered in terror at the sight of gleaming Roman metal armor. For the Greeks, it was even simpler, since they generally preferred to fight half naked to demonstrate their strength. You'd arrive on the battlefield, show off your beautiful muscles, fight, and by evening you'd be home enjoying a delicious dinner. But the Romans were about to face conditions where those beautiful muscles would quickly turn blue from the bitter cold. When the generals led their armies into the dense forests of Germany, the harsh reality of the climate dealt a brutal blow. There was no warm sea breeze there, but instead a biting wind and deep, endless, sticky snow. Soldiers had to stand guard for hours on end, in sub-zero temperatures, without the slightest shelter. And here, pride finally clashed with the basic biological need to keep their limbs intact. But the Romans didn't give up. They simply invented their own ingenious system for surviving without pants. Instead of conceding the barbarians were right, the imperial army began to widely adopt the principle of layering clothing. They decided that if a single tunic didn't protect against the cold, then they needed to wear 3 or 4 tunics. This sounds like a primitive solution, but it was based on a brilliant understanding of the physics of retaining body heat. Modern mountaineers use exactly the same approach, layering high-tech thermal underwear and fleece under their jackets. The Romans came up with this method 2,000 years before the advent of trendy sportswear stores. This layered approach allowed the invincible legions to maintain their traditional appearance in harsh winter conditions. They remained true to their cultural principles, proving to the barbarians the superiority of Roman engineering and tactical genius. But layers of clothing were just the tip of a massive iceberg in their system for combating the cold. Behind this simple idea lay an incredibly complex physiological machine, working itself to the bone every single day. Let's break down exactly how ordinary wool transformed into impenetrable armor against the biting northern frost. The secret to a legionnaire's survival without pants began with the right choice of base material for his clothing. The Roman army used only high-quality sheep's wool to produce soldiers' tunics and heavy cloaks. This material possessed unique natural properties that made it ideal for extreme military campaigns. Wool is capable of retaining the body's heat even when it is completely soaked in freezing rain. Modern cotton would simply freeze the wearer in such conditions, while wool continued to function reliably. The process of making soldiers' clothing was radically different from modern mass factory production of fine fabrics. Roman weavers made tunics incredibly dense, literally packing the woolen threads tightly together until they could go no further. The result was a fabric whose texture resembled coarse felt more than a regular t-shirt. It effectively blocked the biting wind, preventing cold air from reaching the heated skin of a marching soldier. Your modern high-tech windbreaker performs exactly the same function, only it costs dozens of times more. But thick fabric alone was woefully insufficient for surviving the harsh winter in the German forests. The Romans' secret weapon was a natural animal fat called lanolin, found in wool. Usually, when processing expensive fabrics, this fat was completely washed out to make the clothing soft and comfortable. However, for the army, the wool was left untreated, preserving this natural water-repellent and protective layer of the fabric. Thanks to this, the tunic turned into a kind of ancient raincoat from which water simply rolled right off. As I mentioned earlier, in winter, the legionaries would wear several of these thick woolen tunics at once. The first, softest tunic fit snugly against the body and absorbed the acrid sweat during arduous marches. The second created an air pocket that acted as an ideal insulator between the body and the harsh external environment. The third layer, the coarsest and most grease-soaked, protected the soldier from rain, snow, and the cold northern wind. It was a perfect system of thermoregulation, designed down to the smallest detail without the aid of any modern scientific laboratories. The air layer between the tunics quickly warmed up with body heat and created a cozy microclimate around the soldier's torso. As long as the torso and vital organs remained warm, the body continued to actively circulate hot blood. This hot blood flowed abundantly to the bare feet, preventing them from freezing in the bitter cold. Modern medicine confirms that if the body's core is kept warm, the limbs can withstand significantly sub-zero temperatures. The Romans simply intuitively discovered this biological hack and put it to full use every day. Over all these tunics, soldiers always wore a heavy rectangular cloak, which in Latin was called a sagum. This cloak weighed several kilograms and served the legionary not only as clothing, but also as a warm sleeping bag. It fastened on the right shoulder with a special fibula, leaving the right hand free to wield a sword. In the event of a sudden ambush in the woods, a soldier could instantly shed this cloak and engage in fierce combat. The practicality of Roman military equipment always came first, taking precedence over any considerations of personal comfort. The length of the soldier's tunic was also strictly determined by years of practical experience in waging endless bloody wars. It fell just below the knees, reliably shielding the most vulnerable large joints from direct exposure to the wind. At the same time, the shins remained exposed, allowing legionnaires to move freely through mud and deep snow. Long pants in such conditions would quickly get soaked from the bottom, become encased in a crust of ice, and restrict movement. Bare legs, however, could simply be wiped dry with a cloth during a rest stop and then returned to battle. In addition, the tunic was cinched at the waist with a heavy military belt featuring metal plates and jangling pendants. This belt not only securely held the weapon, but also helped press the fabric more tightly against the body. It blocked cold air from entering from below, transforming the layered clothing into a completely airtight thermal cocoon. It was precisely these well-thought-out small details that made the Roman military machine the most effective in the ancient world. They didn't invent complex mechanisms, they simply refined basic elements to absolute technical perfection. Surprisingly, this entire system worked perfectly, even at temperatures around 0 degrees Celsius. Legionnaires could stand guard for hours, wrapped in their heavy woolen cloaks like stone statues. Of course, they still felt the biting cold. After all, miracles don't happen, even in a great empire. But this clothing allowed them to remain combat-ready and avoid fatal frostbite in harsh conditions. Although their true salvation was not the clothing, but constant, unceasing, and extremely exhausting physical movement. The army survived in the north, not because the soldiers simply dressed warmly and hid from the weather. They survived precisely because their bodies functioned like enormous furnaces, constantly burning precious fuel. And to ensure this furnace never went out, Roman generals devised a system of incredibly grueling physical exertion. While modern people try to warm up by a radiator, legionnaires simply grabbed shovels and began to work hard. let's see how endless marches and a Spartan diet force their bodies to generate internal heat. The Roman army never sat still, even when the harshest and snowiest winter months arrived. The generals understood perfectly well that prolonged inactivity in cold weather slowly but surely kills the legion's fighting spirit. Therefore, the soldiers continued to make regular forced marches, covering up to 20 long miles a day. Walking through deep snow with heavy equipment on their shoulders was a true physical and psychological ordeal. But it was precisely this incredible strain that forced the body to generate a huge amount of vital internal heat. Each soldier carried about 30 kilograms of various equipment, weapons, and personal supplies. This included weapons, construction tools, food rations, and heavy stakes for erecting the camp palisade. Moving with such a load across rough terrain would send the pulse racing to its limit within just 15 minutes. The body would begin to sweat profusely, and the woolen tunics would instantly absorb this moisture, keeping the skin relatively dry. Modern trainers call this extreme CrossFit, but for the legionnaires, it was simply tedious routine work. During such an exhausting march, freezing without pants was practically impossible for anyone. Blood circulated through the veins at such a frantic pace that bare legs literally burned with heat. The leg muscles, constantly overcoming the resistance of snow and mud, worked like powerful pumps for hot blood. The main problem for legionnaires during winter marches was not hypothermia, but plain old heat stroke. It sounds absolutely absurd, but sometimes soldiers had to unbutton their cloaks in the freezing cold to cool off a bit. To sustain such colossal energy expenditure, a huge amount of the right kind of high-calorie staple food was required. And this is where the famous Roman soldier's diet came into play, consisting mainly of simple durum wheat. Each legionnaire received about 1.5 kilograms of unground grain daily from state military food warehouses. They ground it themselves with hand mills during rest desk and cooked thick, nutritious porridge or baked bread. Complex carbohydrates provided a slow but steady flow of energy throughout the long winter day. Interestingly, meat consumption in the regular Roman army was considered a sign of desperation and a shortage of normal food. Commanders quickly noticed that on a meat diet, soldiers grew tired more quickly during long, arduous marches. Modern science explains this by the fact that meat takes a long time to digest and diverts blood away from working muscles. Meanwhile, the carbohydrate intake from grains gave the legionnaires endless stamina, much like modern professional marathon runners before a race. The Romans simply practiced this ingenious sports method 2,000 years before the advent of scientific dietetics. In addition to wheat, the diet necessarily included cheese, olive oil, and the famous sour soldier's posca. Posca was a mixture of water and cheap wine vinegar, with the addition of various beneficial local herbs. This drink tasted like sour salad dressing, but it perfectly restored the body's water-salt balance. The vinegar killed harmful bacteria in dirty water, and the acid provided an instant invigorating effect on the exhausted body. It was essentially an ancient energy drink, helping the muscles cope with the grueling daily winter workload. By burning these beneficial carbohydrates, the legionnaire's body turned into a self-sustaining heating system that operated without fail. But this system had one significant drawback that could prove fatal in a cold winter forest. As soon as the march ended and the soldier stopped, his body began to cool rapidly in the icy wind. Sweaty clothing combined with the frost could kill a man faster than any enemy's sharp sword. Therefore, Roman generals strictly forbade the armies from simply sitting down and resting after the end of a hard day's march. Instead of resting, the exhausted legionaries immediately set about the next stage of their endless and brutal physical regimen. They shed their heavy cloaks and began chopping down trees, digging into the frozen ground and hauling massive stones. Building a fortified camp every night was a mandatory rule that tolerated absolutely no excuses or exceptions. Even if the army planned to leave at dawn, the soldiers would still erect a full-fledged defensive wooden fortress. This work kept them from cooling down after the march and gradually brought their heart rate back to a calm state. Human physiology is such that a gradual reduction in exertion protects the heart and immune system from severe stress. The The legionnaires literally dug out their salvation from the cold, using ordinary iron shovels and heavy axes. They worked until their tunics dried out from the heat generated by their overheated, exhausted muscles. This seems like an incredibly harsh approach to people who had just marched 30 kilometers through the snow. But it was precisely this harshness that allowed them to wake up alive every morning on hostile, icy, and dangerous territory. So the secret to surviving without pants lay not only in thick wool, but also in iron discipline. The soldiers simply had no free time to stand around and shiver sadly. They either marched forward, burning calories, or built sturdy walls, turning their energy into safety. However, there remained one more huge problem that had to be dealt with in the northern conditions. What to do with feet that were constantly wading through icy mud and sinking into deep, fluffy snowdrifts. The footwear of a Roman legionary was called a caliga and consisted of sturdy leather sandals with open toes. To a modern person, the idea of walking in sandals in winter sounds like a ridiculous joke from a crazy fashion designer. But these sandals were a true masterpiece of ancient military engineering, thought out down to the last leather strap. The sole consisted of several layers of thick cowhide, tightly compressed and firmly sewn together. It provided excellent shock absorption when walking on rocky roads and protected the foot from sharp objects. The main tactical feature of the caligae was hidden on their underside, which came into contact with the harsh ground. Dozens of iron nails with wide heads were driven into the sole, forming a complex and beautiful geometric pattern. These nails functioned exactly like modern metal studs on winter car tires. They allowed legionnaires to stand firmly on ice, slippery mud, and wet grass during heavy combat. When an entire legion marched along a stone road, the clatter of these nails struck terror into the hearts of all the surrounding tribes. But why did the Romans persist in wearing open-toed sandals in snowy regions instead of closed, warm leather boots? The answer lies in the physics of water freezing and the basic rules of field military hygiene during those harsh times. Closed leather boots inevitably get soaked in deep snow, or when crossing icy mountain streams, water gets inside, accumulates there, and slowly freezes, turning the footwear into an icy trap for the foot. Drying closed boots by a campfire in the field is very difficult, and they quickly become unusable. Caligae, however, solved the problem of wet feet with an elegant simplicity worthy of modern military engineers. Water flowed freely into the open sandals, but drained out just as quickly and easily. Thanks to excellent ventilation, the skin on the feet dried right on the go under the heat generated by working muscles. This saved soldiers from the dreaded trench foot, a disease that decimated armies on a massive scale even in the 20th century. Paradoxically, the open design preserved foot health far more effectively than airtight, damp leather boots. However, standing in the snow completely barefoot was still unbearable, so the legionnaires used a clever life hack. They began wearing udons en masse, which were thick socks sewn from pieces of warm fabric. These socks were worn directly under the caligae, creating a strange visual contrast between the open straps and the hidden heel. Today, wearing socks with sandals is considered the ultimate fashion faux pas, for which your friends will laugh at you. But 2,000 years ago, this combination helped the world's best warriors conquer the cold and harsh northern continents. Often, these soldiers' socks were not knitted from yarn, as we are accustomed to, but rather sewn from coarse woolen cloth. They fit the foot quite loosely, without constricting blood vessels and allowing blood to circulate normally. Sometimes, experienced soldiers would stuff dry grass or straw inside the sock to create an additional insulating layer. The straw absorbed excess moisture from sweat and created an air pocket that excellently retained the foot's precious warmth. If the straw got wet, it could simply be thrown away during a rest stop and replaced with new straw in literally a second. Sometimes, in harsh winter conditions, soldiers would additionally wrap their legs with long strips of thick, prickly woolen fabric. These wraps were called fascias and served as the equivalent of modern compression socks or gaiters for professional athletes. They not only kept the shins warm, but also supported the calf muscles during endless, arduous marches. The fascias covered the part of the leg that remained between the hem of the tunic and the top of the soldier's open-toed shoes. Thus, the legionary's legs remained protected from the wind, yet formally he was still considered to be without trousers. This clever aesthetic system allowed the Romans to observe their cultural prohibitions without sacrificing their toes. Commanders turned a blind eye to the use of these wraps, as they were not considered barbaric clothing by their form. The main thing was that the soldier was healthy, combat-ready, and prepared at any moment to carry out his centurion's orders. And the fact that his feet were wrapped in rags, like ancient mummies, remained a small military secret of the legion. Pride aside, fighting on frostbitten stumps was completely impossible from a tactical standpoint. Archaeologists regularly find the remains of such military woolen socks in the marshes of Germany and in northern Britain. These findings completely shatter the Hollywood myth of half-naked ancient terminators who felt absolutely no pain or cold. They were ordinary flesh and blood people who genuinely wanted comfort in between bloodshed, and they displayed remarkable soldierly ingenuity to adapt their southern gear to the harsh northern weather. But even the best socks couldn't save the army during a night's stay in a snow-covered forest deep in enemy territory. As the sun set and the temperature plummeted, the legions needed more than just a piece of woolen cloth. They needed a safe base where they could take off their frozen gear and regain their strength. And here, the Roman military machine demonstrated its most incredible engineering superiority over the savage northern barbarians. They built temporary cities so quickly that enemies often refused to believe their own eyes. Let's take a look inside a Roman winter camp and see how they heated their large leather tents. A Roman military camp was not just a place to spend the night. It was a veritable fortress with a perfect geometric layout. Every evening, the legionnaires dug a deep trench and built a wooden defensive wall around the perimeter of their new base. This system ensured absolute safety, allowing exhausted soldiers to sleep soundly without fear of nighttime attacks. And a good night's sleep in extreme cold is the key to physical survival and muscle recovery. While the Germans froze in forest ambushes, the Romans rested peacefully behind the impregnable walls of their temporary fort. Inside the camp, soldiers lived in special tents called contubinia, each accommodating exactly 8 people. These tents were not made of lightweight fabric, but of heavy pieces of thick, high-quality calfskin. The leather effectively blocked the icy wind and kept out water, even during the heaviest winter downpours. Furthermore, it excellently retained internal heat, creating a sort of greenhouse effect for the soldiers sleeping inside. 8 large adult men, lying side by side in such a small, enclosed space, acted as human heaters. The concubinae was a close-knit military family that shared absolutely all household duties and hardships. Together, they cooked meals over a campfire, repaired damaged equipment, and kept warm during the cold northern nights. It was strictly forbidden to light an open fire in the tent due to the enormous risk of an accidental large-scale campfire. Therefore, the legionnaires used enclosed braziers with smouldering coals, which provided a gentle and steady background heat. This saved them from carbon monoxide poisoning and allowed them to maintain a comfortable temperature until the frosty morning. If the legion stopped to winter in one place for several long months, conditions became even more comfortable. Leather tents were replaced by sturdy wooden or stone barracks with proper roofs and thick, reliable walls. In such permanent camps, engineers often built full-scale Roman baths with the famous underfloor heating system. This system was called a hypocaust and consisted of a network of empty channels beneath the floor of the massive bath complex. Slaves burned wood in special furnaces, and the hot air circulated directly beneath the feet of the resting legionnaires. For the soldiers, the chance to visit a real hot bathhouse in the middle of snow-covered Germany was a true psychological relief. They could wash away the dirt, sweat, and blood, cleansing their skin's pores after days of grueling military marches. The hot steam warmed their frozen joints, preventing the development of chronic rheumatism from constantly wearing wet, open-toed shoes. And most importantly, the bathhouse reminded them of distant, civilized Rome, for the sake of which they endured all these hardships. They could sit in the warmth, discuss politics, and feel like the true masters of this harsh, wild world. Winter camps also served as massive logistical hubs, where tons of supplies and new equipment were regularly delivered. The command fully understood that a hungry and frozen army would revolt faster than it would defeat a treacherous enemy. That is why the warehouses were bursting with grain, cheese, dried figs, and supplies of warm, high-quality wool for soldiers' tunics. Soldiers constantly received care packages from home from their caring relatives who were deeply concerned for their well-being. These packages often contained warm socks, scarves, and extra woolen cloaks, all handmade at home. Authentic letters from legionnaires have been preserved, discovered by archaeologists at the ancient British frontier at the famous Fort Vindolanda. In one of the letters, a soldier begs his family to urgently send him more warm socks and underwear. This proves that despite all their military bravado, the Romans were desperately cold in the damp northern provinces of Britain. Official equipment was often insufficient to cope with the damp climate and constant icy downpours. Therefore, unofficial care packages from home were critically important for maintaining the morale of ordinary, freezing soldiers. It was in these permanent winter camps that the empire's strict fashion prohibitions began to gradually show a significant and noticeable crack. Far from the capital's critics, officers began to turn a blind eye to minor violations of the prescribed uniform. Soldiers began actively adopting useful wardrobe elements from the local conquered tribes simply to avoid freezing. At first, these were fur capes and extra coarse woolen wraps, hidden beneath long, heavy military cloaks. But soon the moment came when even the most stubborn generals had to acknowledge the obvious superiority of the barbarians' trousers. Contact with the local population showed the Romans that the Gauls and Germans had invented the ideal and practical clothing for winter. Their pants fit snugly around the legs, retained heat, and did not hinder quick movement through the dense, snow-covered forest at all. At first, the Romans looked upon this with disgust, then with a touch of envy, and eventually began to quietly and en masse copy them. After all, when your legs are covered in a crust of ice, the ideals of classical philosophy very quickly fade into the background. The pragmatism of the Roman soldier always triumphed over any ideological dogma when it came to basic physical survival. Thus began the great fashion revolution that forever changed the appearance of the invincible imperial war machine. The transition from proud bare legs to warm, practical trousers took several long and very painful decades. It was a true cultural clash between the capital's snobs and the rugged veterans of the northern frontier legions. And the outcome of this clash proved quite unexpected for those who blindly believed in the infallibility of ancient Roman traditions. Let's move on to the most interesting part of our story and find out how pants conquered the Roman Empire. The conquest of the British Isles came as a real shock to Roman logistics and the familiar standards of comfortable, civilized life. Instead of the dry German frost, the legionnaires were confronted with endless, icy dampness that penetrated to the very marrow of their bones. In Britain, rain could fall for weeks, turning the roads into an impassable mess of cold and very sticky mud. The multi-layered woolen tunics got wet, became heavy, and ceased to effectively retain the internal heat of the soldiers' exhausted bodies. It was here that it became absolutely clear that the old, traditional equipment needed urgent, radical, and intelligent modernization. Auxiliary troops, recruited from local Gallic and Celtic tribes, felt perfectly at home in these conditions. They wore so-called brequets, short, tight-fitting woolen trousers reaching roughly to the middle of the calf. These trousers were made of thick fabric, often decorated with a bright, checkered pattern, and provided excellent protection for the legs against dampness. The Roman legionaries, looking at their energetic allies, quickly realized that foolish pride was not worth a fatal case of pneumonia. They began to buy, trade, or simply take these trousers en masse from the local conquered British population. At first, the Roman versions of the brachiae were quite short and were hidden under the long hems of the soldiers' warm woolen tunics. The legionnaires seemed somewhat embarrassed by their innovation and tried not to attract the attention of inspecting officers and stern generals. But soon the centurions and cohort commanders themselves began wearing the same cropped trousers during winter inspections. It turned out that commanding a huge army was much more comfortable when your teeth weren't chattering from the icy British wind. So the breakaway gradually became an unofficial but ubiquitous element of the winter field uniform on the distant northern frontiers. Interestingly, in Rome at that time, people continued to be outraged by the decline in morals and the barbarization of their valiant army. Senators delivered impassioned speeches about how soldiers were losing their manly bearing for the sake of some shameful comfort. But these politicians sat in their warm marble palaces, sipping warm wine, spiced with exquisite, expensive Eastern spices. Their opinion did not concern the veteran in the least, who stood knee-deep in mud on the wall of Hadrian's Wall for days on end. The gap between the capital's theories and the harsh reality of the trenches became increasingly obvious and utterly insurmountable. Over time, trousers began to evolve, becoming longer and more practical for cavalry and heavy marching infantry. They were essential for horsemen to protect the inner thighs from the coarse, prickly horsehair. As the Roman cavalry played an increasingly important role in later periods, trousers became a symbol of elite shock troops. What had previously been considered the clothing of dirty savages suddenly became an attribute of the highest paid and most prestigious soldiers. It was a brilliant historical paradox that demonstrated the incredible flexibility of Roman military strategic thinking. By the 3rd century CE, the climate in Europe began to gradually change, becoming increasingly cold and unpredictable. The Roman Empire faced what is known as the climatic pessium, when winters became longer and much harsher. Surviving without trousers became physically impossible, even in regions previously considered warm and comfortable. Therefore, imperial authority officially capitulated to the forces of nature and sound military common sense. Breakaway were officially included in the standard list of a legionary's military equipment, issued at the expense of the vast state. In the late Roman Empire, soldiers bore little resemblance to those classic legionnaires from old Hollywood films. They wore long trousers, heavy closed-toe leather boots, and warm tunics with long, thick sleeves. Square shields were replaced by oval ones, and the famous short gladius gave way to a long, heavy slashing sword. The army began to look much more medieval, preparing for the Dark Ages and new global military challenges, and trousers played far from the least or most insignificant role in this visual and tactical transformation. But even when adopting trousers, the Romans managed to do so with their characteristic bureaucratic imperial meticulousness. They standardized the patterns and established mass production at special, enormous state-run textile factories. Instead of the checkered barbarian patterns, they used austere, solid colors suitable for a disciplined regular army. They took a foreign idea, stripped it of its national character, and turned it into the perfect tool of imperial military logistics. This was the classic Roman approach, to assimilate the enemy's best features and use them for the enemy's complete destruction. It is amazing how a single item of clothing can tell the whole story of the rise and fall of a great ancient civilization. The rejection of trousers symbolized Rome's pride and unshakable belief in its own cultural superiority over the rest of the world, and their subsequent adoption demonstrated an incredible ability to adapt and survive in harsh, changing climatic conditions. It is not the army that stubbornly follows ancient traditions against all common sense and logic that wins. It is the army that is ready to change its habits in order to achieve the ultimate, victorious, strategic goal that wins. Today, we take pants for granted as something completely natural and essential for venturing out into any cold street. We don't even stop to think that fierce ideological and political debates were once waged over the right to wear them. But every time you put on warm pants on a winter morning, you are following in the footsteps of the ancient Roman legionnaires. You choose comfort and survival over foolish principles that could cost you your precious physical health. And in this choice lies the greatest wisdom, proven by millennia of bloody wars and endless snow marches. The story of Roman soldiers freezing without pants in the German forests teaches us one very important and useful lesson. The human body is capable of incredible feats of endurance if properly prepared and strongly motivated. The legionnaires compensated for the lack of high-tech clothing with iron discipline, constant movement, and a high-calorie carbohydrate diet. They turned human physiology itself into their main weapon against the merciless and cold forces of the wild. It took modern sports science centuries to simply explain what they did entirely intuitively. The evolution of the Roman military uniform brilliantly demonstrates how practicality eventually triumphs over any lofty ideology. When the empire faced the real threat of its troops freezing to death, it quickly forgot about lofty philosophical matters. The Romans quietly borrowed the idea of trousers from the Celts, improved it slightly, and made it their own state standard. This ability to learn from the enemy and adapt foreign technologies has always been their greatest historical strength. They weren't the most inventive, but they were the most effective administrators and engineers of antiquity. Today we use membrane jackets, heated thermal underwear, and high-tech waterproof winter hiking boots. Our soldiers and tourists are equipped so that they can sleep comfortably on the snow in the coldest sub-zero temperatures. But every time we complain about a slight chill on the way to work, it's worth remembering those incredible ancient men. They conquered half the world in woolen tunics and open sandals, armed only with iron shovels and swords. Their feet were covered in calluses and mud, but they walked with determination along the roads they had built themselves. So the next time you feel like winter in your city is too harsh, just smile quietly. Remember that your body harbors exactly the same powerful hidden mechanisms for generating heat. You too can warm up simply through active movement, just like a legionnaire on the march in cold Gaul. Although, of course, you won't have to build a huge wooden fort and fight a mob of enraged barbarians afterward. Thank goodness we live in an era where the toughest winter challenge is clearing the morning snow off your car. Well, for today, our historical investigation into the gear of ancient legionnaires has come to its logical conclusion. Dress warmer, don't be afraid to break silly rules for the sake of your health, and take care of yourself in any capricious weather. May your winters be comfortable, and may your inner fire always keep you warm in the coldest moments. A huge thank you for your attention, likes, and support of our humble channel dedicated to amazing, forgotten historical facts. See you soon in our next videos, where we'll once again turn your usual ideas about the distant past upside down.